In the autumn of 1887, the land around the settlement of Providence Creek spoke of a coming severity. It was a language written in the frantic industry of squirrels and the unusual thickness of bark on the northern face of the pines. The old trappers, men whose joints ached with the memory of past winters, nodded grimly. They called it a wolf winter, a season that would come with teeth. For Alara, the signs were more personal. They were in the silence of the cabin Liam had built, a silence that had grown vast and cold since the logging accident that spring. She was a widow at 22, and the owner of a marginal plot of land with a cabin whose central hearth, the very heart of a frontier home, was fractured. A jagged, dark line ran through the fieldstone, a fatal wound in the architecture of her survival. Providence Creek was a place built on conviction, and its primary conviction was in the methods of Mr. Silas Croft. He was the master builder, a man whose pronouncements on timber, stone, and mortar were received as gospel. His log cabins were monuments to a specific kind of frontier masculinity: stout, straightforward, and prodigiously hungry for firewood. The fireplaces he built were immense, open-mouthed things of river rock and pride, designed to hold a quarter of a cord at a time. They were symbols of prosperity, roaring with a cheerful, wasteful fire that threw heat 10 feet into a room and, by the immutable laws of convection, pulled a gale of frigid air through every chink in the walls to feed its appetite. To have a Croft hearth was to have made it. To question its design was to question the very foundation of the town's hard-won progress. Alara had no money to commission a new Croft hearth. The small sum Liam had left was a pittance against the coming winter's needs. She approached Mr. Croft not as a client, but as a supplicant. He came to her cabin, his large frame filling the doorway, his eyes scanning the interior with a practiced, dismissive air. He tapped the cracked hearthstone with the steel tip of his boot. "It's a death trap, missus," he declared, his voice a low rumble of finality. "A chimney fire waiting to happen. Worse, it'll leak smoke, and you'll wake up dead. The whole thing needs to come down. We'll build you a proper hearth, one that'll stand 100 years. "I cannot afford that, Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice quiet but steady. "I was hoping it could be repaired." He snorted, a sound of pure derision. "Repair that? That's like putting a patch on a sinking ship. You need a new ship." He quoted a price that was more than the value of her land, a figure designed to end the conversation. He knew her situation. Everyone did. Hesitantly, Alara spoke of another way. "My grandmother, in the old country, they built fireplaces differently, from clay and brick. They held the heat." Croft's expression soured. He looked at this slight, dark-haired woman, an outsider twice over by her ancestry and her widowhood, and saw only foolishness. "Clay? Missus, this isn't the mud hut country your people came from. This is timber country. We build with stone and wood. We build to last." He turned to leave, his judgment rendered. "You try to build some backwards fire pit in here, and you'll either burn to death or freeze. Either way, the bank will have this land by spring." His words were not just a warning, they were a sentence. He repeated the story in the town mercantile, embellishing it for effect. He spoke of the widow's folly, her stubborn refusal of sound advice in favor of some old-world nonsense. Mr. Sterling, the town banker, a man whose heart was as cold and precise as the gold watch he kept chained to his vest, overheard and nodded in solemn agreement. Alara's small parcel of land was a loose thread in his ledger, a debt left by a dead man. Croft's prediction offered a neat, if tragic, resolution. The community, taking its cue from its most respected builder, looked upon Alara with a new kind of pity, the kind reserved for those who seemed determined to author their own demise. She was dismissed, condemned by the flawed conventional wisdom of men who had never learned to doubt themselves. She was alone. That evening, as the autumn wind moaned around the eaves of the cabin, a sound like a hungry animal, Alara did not weep. Instead, she retrieved a small, leather-bound book from a locked wooden chest. The leather was worn smooth with time, the pages brittle and filled with the elegant, looping script of her grandmother, Olena. It was written in a language Alara could read but not speak, a private inheritance of memory and knowledge. Olena had survived winters on the Ukrainian steppe, winters that made the predictions for Providence Creek seem like a mild frost. She had not survived by burning mountains of wood in an open hearth. She had survived with the peach. The journal was not a diary of feelings, but a manual for living. It was filled with precise sketches, measurements, and explanations rooted in a deep, intuitive understanding of physics. Alara turned the pages, her fingers tracing the diagrams her grandmother had drawn decades ago. Here was the firebox, surprisingly small, with a heavy iron door. Here was the complex, serpentine path the smoke must follow, a maze of baffles and channels designed to bleed every last degree of heat from the exhaust gases before they were permitted to escape. And here was the heart of the design, the great bell, an upper chamber where the hottest gases would collect and linger, their heat soaking into the immense surrounding mass. The drawings depicted a structure that was more than a fireplace. It was the thermal core of the home. It was a massive, multi-ton beast of brick, stone, and clay that would occupy the center of the cabin. It had a cooking oven, a niche for drying clothes, and, most wondrously, a wide, flat bench that would be heated from within, a place to sleep on the coldest nights. The principle was simple and profound. A croft hearth was designed to radiate heat from an active fire. The pitch was designed to capture the total energy of that fire and store it in its thermal mass, releasing it slowly and evenly over hours, even days. It was a battery for heat. It was, to the eyes of Providence Creek, utterly backwards. It hid the fire. It convoluted the smoke's path. It was built of humble earth instead of proud stone. It made no sense to a people who equated a large, roaring fire with warmth and safety. But to Alara, reading her grandmother's careful script, it was the only thing that made sense at all. Olena's words were clear. A big fire is a sign of a cold house. A small fire in a warm house is the sign of a wise woman. She closed the book, the scent of old paper and dried ink filling the cold air. The blueprint was before her. The sentence passed by Croft and Sterling was not an end, but a beginning. She began that very day. The first task was demolition. The cracked Croft hearth was a monument of brute force, its stones held together with a stubborn, sandy mortar. Armed with a heavy mallet and a pry bar, Alara attacked it. The work was brutal, jarring, and loud. Each blow sent vibrations through the floorboards and up into the bones of her arms. The sound of stone grinding against iron was a scream of protest. Dust filled the cabin, a gritty fog that coated every surface and filled her lungs. For 2 days, she labored, prying the heavy river stones loose, one by one, and hauling them outside. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and gardening, were soon raw, blistered, and bleeding. Her back ached with a fire that rivaled the one she hoped to build. The men who passed on the road to the lumber mill saw her, a lone woman wrestling with stones half her weight, and shook their heads at the spectacle of her folly. They did not offer to help. They were watching a prophecy fulfill itself. With the old hearth gone, a gaping hole was left in the floor and roof. A cold wind now had free passage through her home. The urgency of her task was palpable. She boarded the hole in the roof, a temporary patch against the increasingly hostile sky. Then she began to dig. The foundation for the peach had to be deep and solid, an anchor to the earth itself. Her grandmother's journal specified a pit 4 feet deep, filled with sand and rock to create a stable, insulated base that would prevent the immense heat from leaching into the ground. Shovelful by shovelful, she excavated the cabin floor, hauling buckets of cold, damp earth outside. The pile of stones from the old hearth grew, but the pile of dirt grew faster. It was a grave she was digging, the townspeople whispered. Her own. The most crucial material was clay. The journal was specific about its properties. It had to be plastic enough to be workable, but with enough silica to withstand immense heat without cracking. She found it, as Olena's notes suggested she might, by the creek bed, a thick, gray seam running beneath the topsoil. For a week, she did nothing but dig and haul. Using a wheelbarrow Liam had built, she moved hundreds of pounds of the heavy, wet clay from the creek to the cabin, her body straining with each muddy step. The work was a penance, a physical prayer. Each load was a testament to her will. Then came the mixing. In a shallow pit she lined with canvas, she combined the clay with sand from the creek and straw from a neighbor's fallow field. The neighbor had given her the straw for free, a gesture he considered charity for the doomed. She added water, and then, taking off her boots, she began to mix the cob with her feet. The cold mud squelched between her toes, pulling at her, trying to hold her fast. It was an ancient, primal dance, stomping and turning, her legs and core burning with the effort. She worked until the mixture was uniform, a thick, fibrous mass. Day after day she mixed, her skin caked with drying mud, her muscles screaming in protest each morning. This was the part Mr. Croft would have called mud hut work. Alara called it building. The first bricks she used were scavenged, reclaimed from the old hearth's chimney. But there were not enough. She needed hundreds more. So she made them. Using a simple wooden mold, she formed brick after brick from the clay mixture, laying them out in long, neat rows to dry in the weak autumn sun. It was a race against the first hard frost, which would ruin any brick that was not fully cured. She covered them with canvas at night, praying for one more week of clear weather. While the bricks cured, she began to build the core. This was the labyrinth, the intricate series of channels that would form the heat exchange system. This was the part that required not just strength, but precision. Using her grandmother's diagrams as a guide, she laid the fire bricks for the small, insulated firebox. It was oriented to face the main room, but its design was starkly utilitarian. There would be no romantic, crackling fire here. A small, cast-iron door, salvaged from an old cook stove, would seal it, allowing her to precisely control the airflow. A hot, fast, efficient burn was the goal, one that consumed the wood completely and generated minimal smoke, but maximum heat. From the top of the firebox, the first flue did not go up. It went sideways. This was the first violation of every principle of fireplace construction as understood in Providence Creek. She built a horizontal channel that ran the full length of the structure's base. Then, at the far end, it turned upwards into a second, higher channel that ran back towards the front. It then switched back again, creating a serpentine path like the coils of a slumbering dragon. Each section was carefully constructed, the mortar applied with painstaking care to ensure there were no leaks. This was the engine of the pitch. The hot gases, desperate to rise, would be forced to travel this long and convoluted path, their heat passing through the brick walls of the flue and into the surrounding thermal mass at every inch of the journey. During this phase of the construction, Silas Croft paid his second visit. He did not come to help, but to witness. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his barrel chest, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw the maze of brickwork, the bizarre horizontal flue. "What in God's name is that?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're building a chimney sideways, missus. The smoke will have nowhere to go. It'll back up and fill this room so thick you'll choke on it before you freeze. The heat will push it through," Alara stated simply, not looking up from her work. She was carefully setting a brick, ensuring it was perfectly level. "Heat rises," Croft said, as if explaining a fundamental law to a simpleton. "It doesn't go for a stroll around the parlor. This is the damnedest folly I have ever seen." He laughed, a deep, booming sound that filled the small cabin. He left, shaking his head, and the story of the widow's sideways chimney became the new joke at the mercantile. They called it Ilara's Folly, a monument to female stubbornness. She ignored them. She continued to build, brick by brick, layer by layer. Around the intricate flue system, she packed the cob, her own mixture of clay, sand, and straw. She built the walls thick, over 2 feet in places, tamping the damp earth into place with a wooden mallet and her bare hands. The structure grew, a monolithic, organic form rising from the floor. It was not pretty. It did not have the sharp, clean lines of Croft's stonework. It was rounded, soft-edged, and earthy, like a landform that had grown inside her cabin. Next came the oven. To one side of the main mass, she constructed a separate chamber, a brick-lined dome connected by a small flue to the main channel. A simple iron damper would allow her to direct the hot gases into the oven chamber to heat it for baking, or bypass it to send the heat directly into the upper bell. Above that, a small, recessed alcove would serve as a spot for drying herbs, mittens, or boots. Finally, she built the 2 most important features. The first was the bench. Extending from the main body of the pitch, she built a low, wide platform, its interior hollow and connected to the flue path. This bench would become a radiant heated piece of furniture, a warm place to sit or sleep. The second was the great bell, the large chamber at the very top of the structure. Here, the hottest gases, having already traveled the long lower labyrinth, would be trapped. They would swirl and slow, giving up the last of their useful heat to the tons of surrounding mass before finally being allowed to exit through a single, modest chimney pipe that went straight up through the roof. By the time she was finished, late in November, the pitch dominated the small cabin. It was immense, a hulking giant of reddish-brown earth that took up nearly a quarter of the living space. It was strange and alien, and to the townspeople, it was unquestionably ugly. Mr. Sterling, the banker, made a special trip to see it. He peered inside, his face a mask of distaste. "You have ruined this cabin, madam," he said coolly. "No one will ever buy it now. I trust your affairs are in order." It was a threat veiled in politeness. He was already composing the foreclosure notice in his head. For a full 2 weeks, Alara did not light a fire. The massive structure needed to cure, slowly and naturally. The moisture had to evaporate from the deep inside of the clay, or else the first hot fire would crack it to pieces. During those 2 weeks, the temperature plummeted. The first snows fell, thin and hard as salt. The cabin was frigid. Alara wore all the clothes she owned, her breath pluming in the air. She ate cold meals and slept under a mountain of blankets, her faith being tested by the creeping, insidious cold. Every fiber of her being screamed for the warmth of a fire, but she waited. Her grandmother's journal was adamant: patience now, or all is lost. On the first day of December, with the sky outside a flat, metallic gray, she decided it was time. She opened the small iron door of the firebox and laid a tiny fire. Just a handful of kindling and a few small pieces of seasoned pine. It was an absurdly small fire for such a monstrous structure, an offering rather than a blaze. She lit it and closed the door, adjusting the air vent to a narrow slit. For the first hour, nothing seemed to happen. The exterior of the pitch remained cold to the touch. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the new chimney pipe, a sign the draft was working. But inside the cabin, the air remained stubbornly cold. She felt a flicker of doubt, a cold dread that perhaps Croft and the others had been right. Perhaps she had spent months of back-breaking labor to build a magnificent, useless pile of mud. She fed the fire a few more small sticks, keeping it small and steady, just as the journal instructed. Then, after the 3rd hour, she felt it. Laying her palm flat against the clay wall of the bench, she felt a deep, resonant warmth, a life force stirring in the core of the beast. It was not the scorching heat of a metal stove or the directional blast of an open hearth. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very substance of the structure. Over the next several hours, the warmth spread, creeping through the entire surface of the pitch, turning the massive clay structure into a single, enormous, gentle radiator. By evening, the cabin was transformed. The bone-chilling dampness was gone, replaced by a comfortable, even heat that filled every corner of the room. There were no drafts. The air was still and pleasant. The tiny fire in the firebox had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, yet the pitch continued to pour warmth into the room, a silent and tireless servant. She sat on the bench, the clay warm beneath her, and felt a profound sense of vindication that was as warming as the heat itself. She had not built a folly. She had built a furnace. She had built survival. The wolf winter arrived not with a howl, but with a whisper. On the 12th of January, 1888, The sky turned a strange, yellowish gray. The air grew unnaturally still, and a deep, penetrating cold settled over the land, a cold that felt ancient and absolute. The old-timers recognized it as a blue norther. Within hours, the temperature dropped 50 degrees. The wind rose, a relentless, scouring force that picked up the fallen snow and hurled it sideways, creating a blinding, horizontal blizzard. It was a storm that had a name, though they would not know it for weeks. The school children's blizzard, a meteorological terror that would sweep across the plains and become the stuff of grim legend. In Providence Creek, the reality was immediate and brutal. The wind was a physical blow, a thief that stole the heat from every home. Mr. Croft's magnificent log cabins, the pride of the settlement, became frigid traps. The wind found every tiny gap between the logs, every crack around the window frames, and screamed through them, creating dozens of needle-sharp drafts. The mighty open hearths, which had been sources of such pride, now became liabilities. To combat the cold, the settlers fed them enormous amounts of wood. The fires roared, their flames leaping up the chimneys, but they were fighting a losing battle. The sheer volume of air the fires consumed was staggering, pulling the Arctic cold into the homes even faster. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces scorched by the fire while their backs felt as if they were encased in ice. At the Mercantile, the mood soured, from anxiety to dread. Men who had boasted of wood piles that would last till April now saw them dwindling with terrifying speed. The storm was not a passing squall. It was an occupying army. It laid siege to their homes. Silas Croft, in his own large house, a showpiece of his craft, stalked from room to room, his confidence eroding with every gust of wind that rattled the windows. His wife, Eleanor, was frail, her cough worsening in the drafty air. He kept the fire in their grand hearth blazing, a frantic, desperate effort. But the far corners of the room were already succumbing to the frost. He could see his breath in his own parlor. His design, his life's work, was failing. Mr. Sterling, the banker, experienced a moment of pure, clarifying shock when the inkwell on his mahogany desk, a mere 12 feet from his own roaring fire, froze solid. The ink expanded, cracking the delicate crystal. It was a small, quiet catastrophe, but it told him everything he needed to know. The established order, the conventional wisdom, the very physics of their survival were breaking down. The cold was an implacable judge, and it was finding them all guilty of arrogance. In her small cabin, Alara was warm. She had fed the pitch a small load of wood in the morning and another in the evening. The fire itself was never large, just a hot, bright burn for about an hour. But the effect was profound. The tons of clay and brick had absorbed the energy, and now they released it back into the room as a steady, silent tide of radiant heat. The temperature inside her cabin held at a comfortable 68 degrees, even as the world outside descended into a hell of wind and ice. There were no drafts. The pitch required so little combustion air that it did not create the suction effect that was plaguing the other homes. The air was still. The silence was broken only by the muffled shriek of the wind outside, a sound that served only to heighten the sense of peace and security within. She baked a loaf of bread in the oven chamber, the scent of it filling the warm air. She sat on the heated bench, mending a pair of Liam's old wool socks, the warmth seeping into her bones. She was not just surviving the storm, she was living comfortably within it. Her grandmother's knowledge was a shield, an invisible wall of warmth that the wolf winter could not breach. On the third day of the blizzard, the desperation in town reached its peak. The temperature, not accounting for the wind chill that was now a truly murderous force, was 30 below zero. Several families had exhausted their wood piles completely. The community hall, with its large pot-bellied stove, was converted into a refuge, but it too was dangerously cold. The crisis fell heaviest on Silas Croft. As the master builder, the man who had guaranteed the warmth and safety of these homes, their failure was his personal failure. His wife's condition had worsened, her breathing shallow and ragged in the cold air of their bedroom. His own woodpile was nearly gone, sacrificed in a futile attempt to heat a house that was designed to leak warmth like a sieve. A thought, unwelcome and persistent, had been nagging at him. The widow, Ilara. He had condemned her to freeze. He had laughed at her mud pile. In the town's collective imagination, her cabin was the coldest, most dangerous place in the entire valley. A morbid curiosity, mingled with a sliver of shame, gnawed at him. By all logic, she should be dead. Her fire, if she could even get that ridiculous sideways contraption to draw in this wind, would have filled the cabin with smoke, and if not, the small amount of wood she possessed would be long gone. He imagined finding her frozen, a tragic but predictable end to her folly. He felt a grim duty to check. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned, pulling a scarf over his face until only his eyes were exposed. The journey to her cabin was short, less than a mile, but in the teeth of the blizzard it was a perilous expedition. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the breath from his lungs. The snow was so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, navigating by memory of the tree line. His beard and eyebrows froze solid within minutes. The cold was a physical pain, a crushing weight. By the time he saw the dark shape of her cabin through the swirling white, he was half frozen himself, his own mortality a stark and terrifying reality. He stumbled towards it, expecting a dark, silent tomb. The first thing he noticed was the chimney. A thin, almost invisible plume of heat shimmered from it, but there was no smoke. None at all. This confirmed his fears. Her fire had gone out. She was dead. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and cold as the wind. His mockery, his refusal to help. He had been so certain, so arrogant. Then he saw the window. It was not dark. A soft, warm light glowed from within. It was not the flickering, dancing light of an open fire, but a steady, gentle luminescence. And the window pane, it was clear. There was no frost on it, not a single filigree of ice. His own windows were coated in a thick, opaque layer of white frost. This was impossible. He staggered to the door, his gloved hands fumbling, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the wind. He knocked again, harder, using the last of his strength. The door opened. Ilara stood there. She was in her shirt sleeves. Behind her, the cabin was bathed in the warm, steady light of an oil lamp. A wave of silent, radiant warmth washed over him, a physical shock so profound it made him dizzy. It was not hot, dry air. It was a deep, penetrating, and utterly comfortable warmth. He stared at her, uncomprehending. He had come expecting to find a corpse, and instead, he had found an apparition of summer. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice calm, showing no surprise. "You should come in." He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the raging storm. The contrast was dizzying. The violent, shrieking world of white and cold was gone, replaced by a sanctuary of stillness and warmth. The air smelled faintly of baked bread and drying herbs. He looked around, his mind struggling to process what his senses were telling him. There was no roaring fire. He looked at the monstrous clay structure, Alara's folly. A faint, rosy glow was visible through the small grate on the firebox door, the last embers of a dying fire. The beast was quiet. Yet the warmth it poured into the room was as real and steady as the floorboards beneath his feet. Alara was moving about the cabin, her motions unhurried. She was kneading a batch of dough on a floured wooden board. He saw a small pot of something simmering on a cast iron plate set into the top of the pitch. He reached out a trembling, half-frozen hand and touched the clay surface of the heated bench. It was warm. Deeply, wonderfully warm. He sat down heavily, the warmth seeping through his frozen trousers, a feeling so comforting it was almost painful. He looked at her, at the impossible scene before him. How? The word was a croak, torn from his frozen throat. There is no fire. The fire was this morning, she said, not pausing in her work. The heat is in the clay. It will be warm like this until morning. He stared at the pitch. He saw the oven door, the drying niche, the broad, warm bench where he sat. He saw the elegant, simple logic of it, a logic that had been utterly invisible to him before, obscured by his own pride and prejudice. He had built fireplaces designed to display a fire, to be a spectacle. They were theatrical. They burned through a man's labor and a forest's resources for a brief, roaring show. This was different. This was not a fireplace. It was a reservoir. It captured the energy and held it, husbanding it with a peasant's frugality. I built fireplaces to lose heat, he whispered, the admission costing him more than any sum of money. You built one to keep it. He thought of his wife, shivering in their grand, cold house. He thought of the other families, huddled in the freezing community hall. He thought of his own arrogance, his confident predictions of her doom. The weight of his foolishness settled on him, a burden heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. My wife, Eleanor, she is ill, he said, his voice breaking. We have no more wood. Alara stopped kneading the dough. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn understanding. Bring her here, she said. Croft returned to the town not as a man, but as a messenger. He burst into the community hall, his face wild, his words tumbling out. He spoke of the widow's cabin not as a folly, but as a miracle. He described the silent, steady warmth, the lack of drafts, the smell of fresh bread. They stared at him as if he had gone mad, but the desperation in his voice was real. He gathered his wife, wrapping her in a cocoon of blankets, and with the help of 2 other men, carried her on a makeshift sled back through the storm. When they entered Alara's cabin, they fell silent. The experience was the same for them as it had been for Croft. The sudden, shocking transition from a world of brutal, killing cold to one of serene, life-giving warmth was profoundly disorienting. It defied their understanding of the world.
Eleanor Croft was settled onto the warm clay bench, and a sigh of relief escaped her chapped lips as the gentle, radiant heat began to thaw her chilled body. Soon, others followed. Mr. Sterling, the banker, arrived with his own family, his face a mask of pale humility. He did not ask for sanctuary, he begged for it. Alara welcomed them all. Her small cabin, the one they had all dismissed, became an ark.
She fed them hot soup and fresh bread baked in the oven of the structure they had mocked. The very thing they had labeled her folly had become their salvation. They huddled together in the small space, the master builder, the banker, the town's leading citizens, all kept alive by the forgotten knowledge of a Ukrainian grandmother and the unyielding labor of the woman they had condemned. The storm raged for 2 more days. In the close quarters of the cabin, a new social order was quietly born. Status and wealth meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the steady, silent warmth emanating from the great clay beast in the center of the room. They watched Ilara as she moved with quiet confidence, tending the small fires, cooking the meals, her competence a silent rebuke to all their previous judgments. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say. Their world had been turned upside down. The foolish had become wise. The weak had become strong. And the foundation of their entire way of life had been proven rotten. When the blizzard finally broke, the world it revealed was white, silent, and profoundly changed. The men returned to their homes to find them damaged, their water frozen, their livestock dead. The cost of the wolf winter had been immense, but they had survived, thanks to Ilara. In the spring, after the great thaw, a procession of men came to Ilara's cabin. It was led by Silas Croft. He did not carry tools, he carried his hat in his hands. He stood before her, a humbled giant. "Mrs.," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we were wrong. I was wrong. I was a proud fool. Will you teach us?" Mr. Sterling was there as well. He stepped forward and handed her a piece of paper. It was the deed to her land, free and clear. The debt had been canceled. "A small apology from the bank," he said, unable to meet her eyes. And so, the knowledge was transferred. Ilara, the quiet widow, became the town's most important teacher. With her grandmother's journal spread open on a workbench, she explained the principles of thermal mass, of flue paths, of the firebox that burned hot and fast. Silas Croft became her most devoted apprentice. He brought his decades of building experience, his knowledge of mortar and stone, and put it in the service of her grandmother's design. He learned to think not of how to build a bigger fire, but of how to build a better container for its heat. That summer, they did not build new cabins. They rebuilt the old ones from the inside out. In home after home, the great, wasteful Croft hearths were dismantled, and in their place rose the solid, earthy forms of the pitch. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the layout of the home, but the principle was the same. The men who had once mocked her now labored under her direction, learning the forgotten art of mixing cob and laying a sideways flue. The next winter, Providence Creek was a different place. The houses were warm, the woodpiles lasted, the air was still and quiet, free of the drafts that had once been a constant misery. The community was no longer just surviving the winter. They were comfortable in it. Ilara's status was transformed. She was no longer the pitiable outcast. She was a sage, the keeper of the most vital wisdom the town possessed. Her backwards fireplace became the standard, the Croft Ilara masonry heater, as it came to be known. Her grandmother's journal was carefully preserved, its delicate pages treated as a sacred text. Years passed. Ilara never remarried, but she was never alone. She was the heart of the community, a woman whose quiet determination had saved them from their own certainty. Her legacy was not written in stone or inscribed on a plaque. It was written in the warm homes of a thriving settlement, in the generation of children who grew up without ever knowing the bone-deep chill of a wolf winter. It was a legacy of humility, resilience, and the profound, enduring power of forgotten knowledge. It was the triumph of a wise woman's folly.